Hi guys! The story of wine begins in what is now Georgia and Armenia, where people first started making wine about 8,000 years ago. In Georgia, the earliest evidence comes from places like Shulaveri, where archaeologists found special clay pots called kvivri buried in the ground. These pots, shaped like large eggs, were used to make and store wine. The traditional method involved crushing grapes in stone basins and letting the juice ferment in these kvivri. Today, in Georgia's Kakheti region, particularly around towns like Signagi and Telavi, winemakers still use these ancient techniques. The Alaverdi Monastery, one of Georgia's oldest, has been making wine using kvivri for centuries and continues this practice today. In Armenia, the Arini 1 cave complex contains the world's oldest known winery, dating back about 6,100 years. The cave had a clay fermentation vat, grape seeds, and storage jars. Nearby, the village of Arini still produces wine from local grapes, and visitors can see the ancient winemaking equipment at the Arini Wine Factory. The Noravank Monastery, located close to Arini, is another important site where wine has been made for religious purposes since medieval times. Winemaking spread from these areas to Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians in cities like Ur began producing wine around 3000 BC. The ruins of Ur contain evidence of wine storage and drinking vessels. The famous ziggurat of Ur, a massive temple structure, may have been associated with wine offerings to the gods. In ancient Egypt, wine was made in the Nile Delta region, particularly in areas like the Fayoum Oasis. Tomb paintings in places like the Valley of the Kings show scenes of grape harvesting and wine production. The Egyptians stored wine in distinctive amphorae, many of which have been found in tombs, including those in the pyramids at Giza. The Phoenicians, living in cities like Byblos and Tyre along the Mediterranean coast, became important wine traders. They built special storage facilities for wine and developed ports for shipping it to other regions. The ruins of these ancient cities still contain evidence of their wine trade. The Phoenicians spread winemaking to their colonies, including Carthage and modern Tunisia, where archaeologists have found large wine production facilities. On the island of Crete, the Minoans built elaborate palaces like Knossos that included special rooms for storing wine in large jars called pithoi. The palace ruins contain frescoes showing wine-related scenes, such as harvest festivals. Wine was also important in Mycenaean Greece, where palaces like Pylos had records of wine production and distribution. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, the main entrance to the ancient city, may have been associated with ceremonial wine offerings. As Greek civilization developed, wine became central to their culture. The Temple of Dionysus in Athens was dedicated to the god of wine, and the nearby ancient agora contained shops where wine was sold. Greek colonists brought winemaking to southern Italy, building facilities in places like Paestum, where the well-preserved temples stand near ancient vineyards. The Greeks also established wine production on islands like Thasos, where the ancient wine press can still be seen today. The Romans later expanded wine production throughout their empire, building large facilities in places like Pompeii, where the ruins of wine shops and taverns are preserved. The Villa of the Mysteries, just outside Pompeii, contains frescoes showing wine-related rituals. In Rome itself, the Monte Testaccio, an artificial hill made of broken wine amphorae, shows the scale of ancient Roman wine consumption. Roman wine presses and storage rooms can be seen at archaeological sites across Europe, from France to Germany to Spain. Winemaking continued through the Middle Ages, with monasteries like Cluny in France and Eberbach in Germany maintaining vineyards and producing wine for religious and medicinal purposes. Many of these monastic winemaking facilities still exist today, such as the historic wine cellar at Eberbach Abbey. Medieval castles often had their own vineyards, like those at the Château de Guédelon in France, where traditional winemaking methods are still demonstrated. During the Renaissance, wealthy families in Italy built elaborate wine cellars in their villas, such as those at the Villa Medicea di Cafaggiolo in Tuscany. The famous wine-producing regions of Chianti and Montepulciano developed during this period, with many of the same vineyards still in operation today. In France, royal estates like Fontainebleau had extensive vineyards, and the palace cellars stored wine for the court. The age of exploration saw winemaking spread to new parts of the world. Spanish missionaries planted vineyards in Mexico at missions like Santo Domingo de Guzman, using techniques brought from Europe. Jesuit missionaries established vineyards in Argentina and Chile, with some of these early winemaking sites still operating today, like the Jesuit estancia in Corolla, Argentina. In North America, early settlers planted vineyards in places like Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson attempted wine production at Monticello. The Spanish established missions with vineyards in California, including Mission San Gabriel Arcangel, which still maintains its historic winemaking tradition. Later, immigrants from Europe brought their winemaking knowledge to regions like New York's Finger Lakes and Ohio's Lake Erie Islands, where some of the original wineries still operate today. The Industrial Revolution brought changes to wine production, with new technologies like mechanical presses and glass bottles becoming common. Many historic wineries from this period still exist, such as the Bodegas Tradición in Jerez, Spain, which continues traditional sherry-making methods. The development of railroads allowed wine to be transported more easily, leading to the growth of wine regions along railway lines, like those in southern France. In the modern era, wine production has become a global industry, with traditional methods being preserved alongside new technologies. Historic wine regions like Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Tuscany maintain their centuries-old vineyards and wineries, while new regions in countries like Australia, South Africa, and the United States have developed their own winemaking traditions. Many old wineries now operate as museums, such as the Chateau Mouton Rothschild Wine Museum in France, where visitors can learn about the history of wine production. After the Greeks had their fun, the Romans decided to take wine production and turn it into an industrial operation. Around Rome and Pompeii, they built these large wine factories with rows of clay pots called dolia buried in the ground. You can still see them at places like Villa Regina in Bosco Reale. The Romans were all about efficiency, using screw presses to get every last drop from the grapes, which they wrote about in farming manuals that basically said the same things over and over about grape varieties like Aminean and Nomentan. The Romans were the first real wine snobs, going crazy for fancy vintages like Falernian wine from near Naples that they'd age for decades. Down at the port of Ostia, They had massive warehouses stuffed with wine jars ready for shipping across the empire. There's this artificial hill in Rome called Monte Testaccio, made entirely of broken wine jars, about 50 million of them, which tells you they really liked their wine. Wherever Roman soldiers set up camp, vineyards would pop up soon after, which is how places like Germany's Mosel Valley got started in the wine game. Rich Romans drank their wine from fancy silver cups at dinner parties they called convivia, while regular folks went to wine bars called popinae that were basically ancient versions of dive bars. You can still see some of these in Pompeii with their marble counters and built-in storage jars. They had this big temple of Bacchus near the Circus Maximus, where they'd pray to the wine god, probably asking him to cure their hangovers. Roman doctors like Galen prescribed wine for everything from stomach aches to sadness, though their medicine sometimes included weird stuff like lead, which probably didn't help much. Down in Spain, the Romans turned places like modern Andalusia into major wine factories. The area around Cadiz was pumping out so much wine they could barely keep up with demand from Rome. Meanwhile, in France, locals started using wooden barrels instead of clay jars, which was a big deal for shipping wine. Even up in Hungary, Roman soldiers planted vineyards that would eventually become famous wine regions. When the Roman Empire started falling apart, you'd think the wine business would dry up too, but the Catholic Church stepped in to keep things going. Monasteries like Monte Cassino in Italy and Cluny in France became the keepers of wine-making knowledge, carefully writing down all those Roman techniques. These monks were basically the original wine nerds, paying attention to soil types and grape varieties way before it was cool. They kept using Roman tricks for irrigation and hillside vineyards, especially in steep places like Germany's Mosel Valley, where growing grapes on slopes was the only option. The Romans left their mark all over the wine world. There are mosaics at Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily showing grape harvests that look pretty much like harvests today. Museums across Europe have displays of Roman wine tools that aren't too different from what we use now. They set up the whole system we still use, classifying wines by where they're from, aging them properly, even dealing with fake wines. Some things never change. Their shipping routes along rivers like the Rhone and Rhine became the original wine highways, moving product from vineyard to table centuries before trucks existed. So when you're drinking wine today, you're basically tasting history. Those Romans took winemaking from small-time stuff to big business, spreading vineyards further than anyone thought possible. From fancy dinner parties to corner wine bars, they created a wine culture that's still around today. Not bad for a bunch of guys in togas who've been gone for 1,500 years. The way we grow grapes and make wine still follows a lot of their basic ideas, even if we've got better tools now. Their influence stuck around through all those years when wine was mostly made in monasteries, right up until modern times when wine became popular everywhere again. The more things change, the more they stay the same, especially when it comes to wine. After the Roman Empire faded, wine production in Europe fell mostly to monasteries during what we call the Middle Ages. In France's Burgundy region, monks at places like Clos de Vougeot spent years figuring out which patches of dirt grew the best Pinot Noir grapes. Their big stone winery from the 1100s still stands today, looking like a castle but for making wine instead of fighting wars. These monks kept detailed records of their vineyards that would make any modern accountant nod in approval. Down in Bordeaux, things got interesting when Eleanor of Aquitaine married the English king in 1152. Suddenly, the English couldn't get enough of that claret wine, and ships were hauling barrels across the channel non-stop. The Bordeaux merchants got so rich they built fancy buildings around what's now called the Water Mirror Square, where you can see reflections of all that old wine money. Meanwhile, in Portugal, monks at Alcobaça Monastery were aging their wines in cellars with vaulted ceilings that look like they're straight out of a history book. Germany's Mosel River Valley became prime real estate for Riesling grapes during this time. The steep slopes forced winemakers to build stone terraces that look like giant staircases to this day. Hauling grapes up and down those things must have been brutal work. The church ran the show here too, with places like Eberbach Abbey keeping strict records and using wine presses that look like torture devices now displayed in museums. Over in Italy, the Tuscany region started pumping out those straw-wrapped Chianti bottles everyone pictures when they think of Italian wine. Florentine merchants created the first quality control system in 1716, basically an old-timey version of today's wine regulations. Venice became the Mediterranean's wine trading capital, with merchants sipping local Veneto wines in bars along the canals that haven't changed much in 500 years. People drank wine differently back then compared to now. Instead of fancy glasses, they used wooden cups, animal horns, or just passed around a shared bowl. Not exactly hygienic by today's standards. Rich folks might have metal goblets, but your average person made do with clay mugs. Doctors prescribed specific wines for different health problems, claiming certain types could cure everything from the plague to bad moods, which we now know is nonsense. The Catholic Church controlled most wine production during these centuries, using it for communion and running what amounted to Europe's largest wine distribution network. Pope Clement V even moved the church headquarters to Avignon, partly to be closer to the Rhone Valley vineyards, the original Holy Relocation package. Over in Hungary, they discovered how to make sweet Tokaji Azu wine from moldy grapes, which became a hit with royalty across Europe. When the Renaissance rolled around, wine started getting fancier. The Medici family in Florence threw parties with actual wine fountains, while Burgundy's dukes hoarded the best vintages for themselves. The big game changer came in the 1600s, with glass bottles that could be corked, finally allowing wine to be aged properly instead of drunk fresh like juice. This led to the start of wine collecting as we know it today. Wine production methods didn't change too much during these centuries. They still crushed grapes by foot in stone troughs and pressed them with wooden contraptions turned by hand. Storage improved slightly with better barrels, but the basic process remained the same from Roman times until the industrial age. The main difference was that monks and merchants kept better records of what worked where, slowly figuring out which grapes grew best in which locations. Trade routes expanded during this period, with wine being shipped farther than ever before. River systems like the Rhine became liquid highways for wine barrels, while sea trade brought Mediterranean wines to northern Europe. Taxes and tariffs on wine became major sources of income for cities and kingdoms, with toll stations set up along major transport routes. Some of these old wine toll buildings still stand along rivers in Germany and France. The whole system moved slowly toward what we'd recognize as modern wine culture. Regions became known for specific styles, quality levels started being formalized, and the idea of vintages, good years versus bad years, became more established. By the time Columbus sailed to America, Europe's wine traditions were deeply entrenched, ready to be exported to new worlds. The stage was set for wine to go global, but that's a story for next time. For now, just remember that every time you see a wine bottle today, it's carrying centuries of monastic record-keeping, merchant trading, and royal indulgence in its DNA. The expansion of wine production to the Americas followed predictable patterns. Spanish missionaries brought grapevines to Mexico in the 1500s, establishing the first vineyards near Parras to make sacramental wine. The Mission San Lorenzo became an early center of winemaking, using basic methods similar to those in Spain. Buildings from this period show simple adobe construction with open fermentation areas and shaded storage spaces. The tradition continues today at Casa Madero, which calls itself the oldest winery in the Americas, though the original mission buildings are long gone. California's wine story began with Spanish missions along El Camino Real. Father Junipero Serra planted vineyards at each mission from San Diego to Sonoma, using a grape variety now called Mission grape. The buildings followed standard mission architecture, whitewashed adobe walls, red tile roofs, and central courtyards. Some original mission wineries remain, like the one at San Gabriel Mission near Los Angeles, though most were replaced long ago. When Gold Rush settlers arrived, they preferred European grape varieties and established commercial wineries like Buena Vista in Sonoma, which still has its 1857 stone winery building. South America's wine industry developed around colonial settlements. In Argentina, Jesuit priests planted vineyards in Mendoza in the 1500s, using irrigation channels called acequias that still exist today. The traditional bodegas featured thick adobe walls and shady patios for fermentation. Some old wineries like Bodega La Rural in Maipú preserved these original buildings as museums. Chile's wine history centers around the Central Valley, where colonial haciendas like San José de Apalta combined wine production with other agriculture. Their long, low buildings with clay tile roofs followed Spanish designs adapted to local conditions. North America's eastern colonies struggled with native grape varieties until successful European vines were established. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson attempted winemaking at Monticello using European methods, though he faced constant failures. The original brick outbuildings where he experimented still stand. Pennsylvania's early German settlers had better luck, establishing wineries like Pennsbury Manor that used native grapes. Their stone cellars and spring houses provided cool storage, following traditions from the Rhine Valley. The 1800s brought industrial-scale winemaking to America. In Ohio's Lake Erie region, commercial wineries like Lon's Winery on Middle Base Island used local Catawba grapes. Their buildings featured limestone construction and underground cellars for temperature control. Missouri's German immigrants established vineyards along the Missouri River, with stone cellars like those at Stonehill Winery in Herman that remain tourist attractions today. These Midwestern wineries shipped large quantities of wine by steamboat until Prohibition. California's wine industry grew rapidly after statehood. Italian immigrants like the Sparborough family built wineries in the Napa Valley using local stone and wood. The original Francis Ford Coppola Winery in Sonoma preserves this early 20th century architecture. Greek immigrants established the Santa Clara Valley wine region, with wineries like Paul Masson using California Mission Revival-style buildings. The University of California at Berkeley established a viticulture program that helped standardize practices across the state. South Africa's wine history began at the Cape of Good Hope in 1659. The Dutch East India Company planted vineyards to supply ships using Cape Dutch architecture, whitewashed gabled buildings that remain iconic today. Groot Constantia, established in 1685, preserves these original buildings as a museum. The traditional Cape style combined Dutch, German, and French influences in both winemaking and architecture. Slave labor built many early wineries, with original slave quarters still visible at some historic estates. Australia's wine industry started with British colonization in 1788. The MacArthur family established Camden Park near Sydney, using Georgian-style buildings adapted to the climate. German settlers in the Barossa Valley built wineries like Seppeltsfield in the 1850s, featuring Germanic architecture with Australian adaptations. Their underground cellars and above-ground stone buildings remain in use. The Hunter Valley's early wineries, like Wyndham Estate, used simple timber and iron constructions suited to the hot climate. New Zealand's wine history is more recent, beginning in earnest in the 1970s. Early wineries like Mission Estate in Hawke's Bay adapted existing fruit processing buildings. The traditional New Zealand shed style of winery construction, simple, functional buildings, remains common, though some larger wineries now use more elaborate designs. Marlboro's first commercial winery, Montana Brancott Estate, preserves its original 1970s buildings alongside modern eau. The modern era of winemaking brought standardization to the industry. In California's Napa Valley, wineries adopted similar designs featuring tasting rooms with long wooden bars and outdoor patio areas. Places like Robert Mondavi Winery established the template, mission-style architecture with red tile roofs, courtyard fountains, and rows of oak barrels on display. Visitors follow predictable tour routes through fermentation rooms and barrel caves before ending in the retail area. Most wineries along Highway 29 offer nearly identical experiences, differing mainly in the wines poured and logo merchandise sold. European wine regions maintained their traditional appearances while modernizing operations. Bordeaux's Grand Chateau like Margaux and Lafite Rothschild kept their 18th century facades while installing stainless steel tanks indoors. The cellars remain lined with identical oak barrels, replaced on regular schedules. Tours follow set scripts discussing terroir and aging processes before concluding with samples in nearly identical tasting rooms. Small family wineries in Burgundy preserved their stone fermentation buildings while adding modern temperature controls, creating hybrid facilities that look old outside but function with new technology inside. Australia's wine industry developed characteristic styles seen throughout the Barossa Valley. Large producers like Penfolds use functional metal buildings alongside historic stone structures. The typical visitor center features corrugated iron roofs, broad verandas, and displays of antique harvesting equipment. Tours emphasize the region's German immigrant heritage before offering samples in nearly identical tasting areas. Even smaller wineries follow this pattern, differing mainly in scale rather than layout or presentation. South America's wine regions adopted similar modernization patterns. In Argentina's Mendoza province, wineries like Catena Zapata combined Spanish colonial architecture with state-of-the-art facilities. The typical bodega features adobe-style walls enclosing temperature-controlled fermentation halls. Visitor experiences follow predictable sequences: vineyard tours explaining high-altitude growing conditions, walks through barrel rooms, and tastings at long wooden bars. Most include token displays of traditional concrete fermentation vats, now used only for show. South Africa's wine country around Stellenbosch preserved Cape Dutch architecture while updating production methods. Whitewashed gabled buildings house modern tasting rooms where visitors sample wines in settings that mimic 18th century decor. The standard tour includes historical anecdotes about early settlers before transitioning to contemporary winemaking practices. Even new constructions like Delaire Graff Estate incorporate traditional design elements to maintain regional character while using current technology. New Zealand's Marlborough region developed its own version of standardized wine tourism. Nearly all wineries feature simple timber and glass structures with views of the vineyards. Tastings occur at long counters where staff explain Sauvignon Blanc characteristics using identical terminology. A few historic sites like Mission Estate maintain older buildings, but most opt for functional modern designs that prioritize efficiency over charm. The region's success with Sauvignon Blanc created remarkable uniformity in both production methods and visitor experiences. Wine education became standardized through global certification programs. Courses cover identical material whether taught in Napa, Bordeaux, or Adelaide. Students learn the same tasting techniques, use the same vocabulary, and study the same regions. Examinations test knowledge of standardized quality indicators and production methods. This formalized education created remarkable consistency in how wine professionals worldwide describe and evaluate wines, regardless of origin. The global wine market operates through identical distribution channels. Importers, distributors, and retailers follow the same business models in every major market. Wine shops organize inventory by country then region, using nearly identical display methods. Restaurants construct wine lists following universal formats: sparkling wines first, then whites, reds, and desserts. Even wine storage units for collectors adhere to industry-standard temperature and humidity settings regardless of location. Modern winemaking equipment looks and functions the same worldwide. Stainless steel tanks from the same manufacturers appear in facilities across continents. Presses, pumps, and bottling lines operate identically, whether in Chile, France, or Australia. Laboratory equipment for analyzing wine chemistry comes from a handful of global suppliers. This technological uniformity ensures production methods vary little between regions, contributing to the increasing similarity of wines from different areas. Climate change has prompted nearly identical responses across wine regions. Growers worldwide plant similar drought-resistant rootstocks and install comparable irrigation systems. Harvest dates have moved earlier by comparable margins in California, Australia, and Europe. Research stations share findings that lead to parallel adaptations in vineyard management. The challenges manifest similarly regardless of location, as do the attempted solutions promoted by industry groups. Future developments suggest continued convergence. Emerging regions like China's Ningxia province replicate established models rather than innovating new approaches. Winery architecture increasingly follows global rather than local styles. Even consumer preferences trend toward uniform international tastes. The wine world appears destined to become more standardized, with regional distinctions continuing to diminish over time. What began as diverse traditional practices has evolved toward universal methods and experiences. The business side of wine operates with remarkable consistency across regions. In California's Napa Valley, wineries follow similar pricing strategies based on production costs and brand reputation. Tasting rooms along Highway 29 charge comparable fees for wine flights, typically between $20 and $50. Staff at different wineries give nearly identical explanations about the tasting process, using standard phrases to describe wine characteristics. Retail areas display bottles in similar arrangements, with less expensive wines on lower shelves and premium selections at eye level or in special cases. Most wineries offer memberships with comparable benefits, discounted purchases, exclusive releases, and invitations to special events. French wine regions maintain traditional business practices with modern adaptations. In Bordeaux, the en primeur system continues unchanged for decades, with buyers sampling barrel samples each spring before committing to purchases. Chateau maintains similar price structures based on their 1855 classification rankings, despite fluctuations in quality between vintages. The negociant system functions as it has for centuries, with merchants handling distribution while producers focus on winemaking. Visitors to the region encounter identical sales approaches at different estates, beginning with vineyard tours before progressing to tastings and purchase opportunities. Italian wine producers follow comparable commercial models throughout the country. The Cantina Sociale system allows small growers to pool resources for production and marketing. Wineries in Chianti and Barolo employ similar direct-to-consumer strategies, offering tours that conclude in nearly identical tasting rooms. Online sales platforms use standardized formats regardless of producer size, with identical shipping options and case discounts. Even small family wineries maintain websites following the same basic templates: history page, product listings, and contact forms. Spanish wine businesses operate with remarkable uniformity across regions. Rioja's bodegas employ similar aging classifications that determine pricing tiers. Most maintain nearly identical visitor programs: tours of underground cellars followed by tastings in stone-walled rooms. The larger producers like Marqués de Riscal and López de Heredia use comparable distribution networks, selling through importers in foreign markets while maintaining direct sales at their estates. Smaller wineries cluster into regional associations that handle collective marketing using standardized promotional materials. German wine commerce follows predictable patterns along the Rhine and Mosel rivers. The VDP classification system creates consistent quality hierarchies that influence pricing. Most producers offer similar tasting room experiences, with long wooden bars and flights organized by sweetness levels. Wine clubs operate on nearly identical models throughout the region, with seasonal shipments and member discounts. Even the smallest family wineries use the same label designs. Tall, slender bottles with Gothic lettering emphasizing vineyard names and quality categories. Australian wine businesses demonstrate similar standardization. Large producers like Penfolds and Jacobs Creek follow identical national and international distribution models. Their visitor centers offer comparable experiences, self-guided tours ending in expansive tasting rooms with retail sections. Smaller Barossa Valley wineries employ nearly identical direct sales strategies, relying on cellar door traffic and wine club memberships. Pricing follows predictable patterns based on grape variety, region, and production volume regardless of producer size. South American wine industries operate with parallel business structures. Argentina's Mendoza region relies heavily on export markets, with wineries using similar international distributors. Domestic sales follow identical patterns: premium wines sold in major cities, value brands in supermarkets. Chilean producers emphasize foreign markets even more strongly, with nearly all large wineries maintaining identical export-oriented production strategies. Visitor experiences at major estates like Concha y Toro follow scripted routines combining historical narratives with modern winemaking explanations before concluding in similar tasting rooms. The global wine trade functions through standardized financial systems. Letters of credit, shipping contracts, and customs documentation follow identical formats regardless of origin or destination. Insurance products cover standard risks: spoilage, breakage, and temperature fluctuations during transit. Payment terms repeat across markets, typically net 30 or 60 days for commercial buyers. Even small wineries use accounting software specifically designed for the wine industry, tracking inventory and sales in nearly identical ways worldwide. Marketing approaches show remarkable consistency across regions. Social media campaigns emphasize similar visual elements: vineyard landscapes, harvest activities, and cellar operations. Influencers use identical tasting note formats, whether reviewing California Cabernet or French Burgundy. Print advertising follows comparable creative strategies, with bottle shots accompanied by brief tasting descriptions and awards listings. Trade show booths employ similar designs: wood finishes, backlit displays, and tasting counters arranged to maximize traffic flow. Future business trends suggest continued convergence. E-commerce platforms standardize online sales experiences across borders. Blockchain applications promise identical provenance tracking from vineyard to consumer. Direct-to-consumer shipping regulations gradually align between countries. The wine business appears destined for increasing uniformity as global markets integrate further and best practices spread universally. Regional distinctions that once defined commercial approaches continue diminishing as standardized models dominate worldwide. Wine production follows similar patterns in most parts of the world today. In California, the process begins each year with pruning vines in January and February. Workers move systematically through rows of grapes, cutting back last year's growth in preparation for the new season. Large wineries in places like Napa Valley use machines for many tasks, while smaller producers still do some work by hand. The weather remains a constant concern, with growers checking forecasts daily and adjusting their plans accordingly. The buildings used for making wine look much the same everywhere. Large metal tanks stand in rows inside warehouse-like structures. Wooden barrels fill storage areas where the temperature and humidity stay carefully controlled. Tasting rooms typically have long counters where visitors can sample wines, with shelves displaying bottles for sale. Many feature outdoor seating areas with views of vineyards. The designs follow practical needs rather than standing out as unusual or creative. Harvest time brings similar activity across wine regions. Workers pick grapes when tests show the right sugar levels, usually between August and October. The fruit travels quickly to the winery where machines remove stems and crush it. Juice flows into tanks to begin fermentation, a process that happens the same way whether in France, Australia, or South America. Workers monitor temperatures and take samples to check progress at regular intervals. Rules about wine names and labels create uniformity between countries. Certain words like reserve or estate bottled mean specific things that don't change from place to place. Government agencies check that wineries follow these requirements before approving sales. The information on back labels tends to repeat the same details about alcohol content, producer location, and grape varieties. Wine shops organize their selections in predictable ways. Bottles grouped together by country first, then by region within that country. Price tags show cost per bottle clearly, with more expensive wines often kept in separate cases or behind counters. Staff receive training to describe wines using standard terms about fruit flavors, acidity, and body. Customers can expect to find similar selections whether shopping in New York, London, or Tokyo. Restaurants handle wine service nearly identically worldwide. Servers present the bottle, show the label, and open it at the table. They pour small tastes for the person who ordered before filling glasses for everyone. Wine lists follow the same format, starting with sparkling wines, then white, red, and dessert wines. Prices typically mark up bottles 2 or 3 times above retail cost. Wine education programs teach the same information everywhere. Classes begin with how grapes grow, then move to fermentation and aging. Students learn to identify common aromas and flavors using standardized tasting techniques. Exams test knowledge of major regions and grape varieties, with passing scores leading to certificates recognized across the industry. The curriculum changes little from year to year. Trade shows for wine professionals feature similar displays in every location. Booths showcase bottles from different regions, while equipment companies demonstrate the latest tools for vineyards and cellars. Seminars cover familiar topics like marketing trends and new regulations. Attendees exchange business cards and discuss orders for future shipments, following routines established over decades. Wine competitions use judging systems that vary little between events. Samples arrive in identical glasses marked only with numbers. Experts swirl, sniff, and taste each one before assigning scores based on appearance, smell, and flavor. Medals awarded to winners follow the same gold, silver, and bronze categories used in other industries. Results get published in formats that make easy comparisons between vintages and producers. Climate change affects all wine regions in comparable ways. Warmer temperatures cause grapes to ripen earlier than in the past. Drought creates problems for irrigation in places like California and Australia alike. Growers respond by planting different grape varieties or changing trellis systems, solutions that spread quickly between regions facing similar challenges. Research stations share findings that help vineyards adapt to shifting weather patterns. Future developments seem likely to continue these trends toward sameness. New technologies get adopted everywhere at about the same time. Consumer preferences shift in similar directions across different countries. Regulations become more alike as governments coordinate standards. The wine world grows smaller and more uniform with each passing year, leaving little room for unique local traditions to survive unchanged. What began as diverse regional practices has become increasingly standardized on a global scale. Wine consumption habits have become largely similar across different countries and cultures. People typically drink wine in the evening, often with meals, following patterns that vary little between New York, Paris, or Tokyo. Restaurants serve wine in nearly identical glasses, with the bowl shape designed to concentrate aromas. Portion sizes remain consistent, with a standard pour measuring about 5 ounces regardless of location. Most establishments offer wine by the glass in similar selections, usually including one sparkling, a few whites, several reds, and sometimes a dessert wine. The way people shop for wine shows remarkable consistency. Supermarkets arrange bottles by country of origin, then by color: white, red, then rosé. Prices follow predictable ranges, with cheaper wines on lower shelves and more expensive options at eye level or in special displays. Staff recommendations appear on small cards attached to shelves, using familiar descriptions about fruit flavors and food pairings. Liquor stores follow nearly identical layouts, with additional sections for regional specialties or collector items. Home storage of wine follows common practices everywhere. Those who collect wines typically use temperature-controlled units that maintain ideal conditions. More casual drinkers keep bottles in cool, dark places like basements or closets. Serving temperatures have become standardized, with whites chilled and reds at slightly below room temperature. Most people use the same type of corkscrew, with some opting for more expensive lever models, while others choose simple waiter's tools. Wine festivals occur in every major production region with similar formats. Local wineries set up booths where attendees can taste samples. Food vendors offer snacks intended to pair with the wines. Some events include educational seminars or live music, but the basic experience remains the same whether in California, Italy, or Australia. Tickets usually include a souvenir glass and a certain number of tasting tokens, with additional pours available for purchase. Wine clubs operate on nearly identical models worldwide. Members receive regular shipments of selected bottles, typically quarterly. Accompanying materials describe the wines using standard terminology about aromas, flavors, and suggested food matches. Pricing structures follow similar tiers based on quality and exclusivity, with higher levels offering limited production wines or access to special events. Cancellation policies and delivery terms show little variation between different clubs. the role of wine in holidays and celebrations has become uniform across cultures. Champagne toasts mark weddings and New Year's Eve parties in nearly every country that consumes wine. Traditional holiday meals often include specific wine pairings, like red wine with Christmas dinners or sparkling wine with anniversary celebrations. Gift-giving customs involving wine follow similar patterns, with bottle presentation bags and decorative tags available in stores worldwide. Wine tourism follows predictable itineraries in every major region. Visitors start at welcome centers to get maps of local wineries. They proceed to tasting rooms where staff explain the production process before offering samples. Many purchase bottles to take home as souvenirs. Some larger wineries add restaurants or art displays to enhance the experience, but the core activities remain the same. Tour buses follow set routes between popular locations, with schedules that allow similar amounts of time at each stop. Wine's place in popular culture shows consistent themes across nations. Movies and television depict characters drinking wine in similar social contexts. Romantic dinners, business meetings, or relaxing evenings at home. Product placement ensures recognizable labels appear frequently, though the specific brands may vary by country. Celebrity endorsements follow familiar patterns, with famous chefs, actors, or musicians associating themselves with particular wines or regions. Health discussions about wine repeat the same points internationally. Moderate consumption often gets linked to potential heart benefits, while excessive drinking raises concerns about various risks. Government guidelines suggest similar limits for men and women in most countries. Warning labels on bottles vary slightly, but generally convey comparable messages about alcohol's effects. Medical professionals offer nearly identical advice about wine consumption to patients worldwide. The future of wine consumption appears unlikely to change dramatically. Younger generations show similar patterns of wine drinking as their parents, though some prefer different styles or brands. Economic factors influence purchasing decisions in predictable ways across markets. Health trends may shift some preferences toward lower alcohol options, but the fundamental role of wine in social and culinary contexts seems likely to continue along established lines. The globalization of wine culture has created a remarkably uniform set of drinking habits that show little sign of significant divergence in coming years. So, a really long time ago, way before anyone else, some people showed up in America. They were the first ones ever to live here. These people are called the Paleo-Indians. That's just the name scientists use for them. It means old Indians. They weren't so different from people today, you know? Just people. But they lived a super long time back, and life was totally different then. Really hard, probably. Everything was way more basic. Where did they come from? Well, they walked. They came all the way from Asia. Think about where Russia is now. That general area. They walked for ages, probably following animals or just looking for somewhere better. Back then, something weird was going on with the land and the water. The place where there's water now, between Alaska and Russia, that spot called the Bering Strait, back then it wasn't water. It was dry land, solid ground, a big bridge of land, basically. Because so much water was frozen up in giant ice sheets called glaciers, So these people just walked right across that land. It was cold, really cold, like Ice Age cold. Not fun walking weather for sure. But they did it. They kept going. Eventually, they got to Alaska. Alaska was the first place they hit in America. Still pretty cold and icy up there back then. Not exactly the best spot to stop. So they kept moving. They wanted to go south. South is usually warmer, right? Makes sense. They wanted to get away from all that ice. There were basically two ways they could go south from Alaska. One way was along the edge of the big ocean, the Pacific Ocean, walking right by the water. That way probably had stuff like shellfish to eat, maybe fish, seaweed, birds, things like that. Maybe they even had simple boats, but probably not big ones, just something to help along the shore. The other way was inland. Later on, when things warmed up a tiny bit, a path opened up between two huge walls of ice that covered most of Canada. Like a hallway through the ice. Some groups took that path inside the land, walking through valleys between giant ice mountains. That must have felt strange. Either way, coastal or inland, it took a long, long time. Generations, probably. Kids were born, people got old, all while they were slowly moving south, step by step, year by year. What did they do once they got further into America? Same thing people everywhere did back then. Looked for food. All day, probably. That was the main job. Food. They hunted animals. Big animals, mostly. Really big ones that we don't even have anymore. Like mammoths. Think of an elephant, but hairy and huge. Or giant sloths. Big, slow-moving things. Or huge bison. Hunting those wasn't easy. Probably pretty dangerous. They used spears, not fancy metal spears. Spears made of wood with sharp stone points tied on the end. They made these points out of rock, chipping away pieces until they got a sharp edge. The most famous kind of point is called a Clovis point. They found a bunch of them first near Clovis, New Mexico, so that's the name. But they made other kinds too. Besides hunting, they also gathered stuff. Whatever they could find that was safe to eat. Berries sometimes. Roots dug up from the ground. Nuts. Seeds. Maybe eggs from birds' nests. Whatever was around. They moved around a lot, probably. Following the animals they hunted, or going where the plants were growing. They didn't stay in one place for years like people do now. They set up camp, stayed a while, then packed up and moved on when the food got scarce or the seasons changed. Their stuff was simple. Stone tools, mostly. Sharp knives for cutting. Scrapers for cleaning hides. Maybe drills for making holes. Things like that. Wood and leather stuff rots away, so we mostly just find the stone parts now. Their camps weren't fancy houses. Maybe simple shelters made of branches and hides, or sleeping under rock overhangs, just enough to get out of the weather. Life was simple. Find food, eat, make tools, move, find more food, try not to get hurt, raise the kids. That was pretty much it, day after day. Nothing exciting, just surviving. Year after year. Generation after generation. Slowly spreading out across this huge new land they found. Just people, walking around, looking for something to eat in a very big, very empty place. Time passed. A lot of time. Thousands of years, actually. Things slowly changed for the Paleo-Indian people. The world around them didn't stay the same. Remember those giant ice sheets covering so much land? They melted, more and more over time. The weather overall got warmer. Places that used to be frozen and bare became covered in forests or wide grasslands. The sea levels also rose because of all the melted ice. That old land bridge they walked across from Asia, it got covered by water, completely gone. No more walking back that way for anyone. The biggest change for them was probably the animals. Those huge animals they used to rely on for hunting, like the mammoths and the giant ground sloths and the really massive types of bison. Most of them disappeared, died out, gone forever. Why? Well, the changing weather probably messed up the places they needed to live and the plants they needed to eat. And maybe, just maybe, people hunting them so much over a long time didn't help either. It got harder and harder to find these giant animals. Then it became impossible. So hunting those giants stopped. That was a huge change. They had to completely change how they found their food. No more big mammoth hunts. So what did they do instead? They started hunting smaller animals way more. Animals like deer became really important. Rabbits, birds, maybe fish and turtles became a bigger part of their meals. They also probably spent even more time gathering plants, roots, berries, nuts, and seeds than before. They got really good at using all kinds of smaller animals and all sorts of plants. They had to adapt to survive. Their tools changed a bit too. Those famous Clovis spear points, you saw them less and less. People started making different styles of stone points, maybe better suited for going after deer or rabbits or used with different throwing sticks. Life still meant moving around following food, but maybe the routes changed with where the new animals lived and where the good plants grew. How do we even know all this stuff about people who lived so incredibly long ago? We don't have any of their stories written down. No pictures they drew. We know because of archaeology. That just means people digging carefully in the dirt, layer by layer, looking for old things left behind. They find stuff. Mostly stone tools, because stone lasts. Those spear points, scrapers for hides, knives for cutting. Finding a Clovis point tells us they were in that spot a very long time ago. Finding different points later tells us things changed over time. Sometimes, very rarely, they find other things. Animal bones with cut marks from stone tools, clear proof they hunted and ate that animal. Even rarer, they find actual footprints pressed into mud that later turned hard as rock, like at White Sands in New Mexico. That's amazing. Like seeing exactly where someone stepped thousands of years ago. They also find places where these people camped briefly. Old fire pits, called hearths. Maybe piles of stone chips left over from making tools. Places like Cooper's Ferry in Idaho or sites near Clovis in New Mexico give us important clues about where they lived and what they did. The weather getting warmer wasn't all bad news. More places became good for living. Forests grew thicker. Grasslands spread wider. There were more areas with plants to gather and animals to hunt. So, the Paleo-Indian people, and their children, and their children's children, just kept spreading out. They went further south, all the way down through what's now Mexico. They filled up more of North America. Some groups probably even went way down into South America over a long, long time. The land wasn't empty anymore like it was at the very start. More and more little groups of people were living scattered across different spots. So, what finally happened to the Paleo-Indian people? Did they just vanish one day? They didn't disappear. They were still here. But their way of life, the specific Paleo-Indian way, slowly changed over hundreds and hundreds of years. As the big Ice Age animals vanished completely and the weather settled into something closer to today's, they had to adjust more. Their tools kept changing shape and style. How they lived, how they got food, maybe even how their family groups were set up, shifted bit by bit. The old Paleo-Indian style faded away. New ways of doing things emerged slowly. Different regional styles of tools and living appeared across the huge continent. The people who came after, living in these different ways across America, the many groups we later called different tribes or nations, they were all the descendants of those first Paleo-Indians. Their kids' way, way down the line. Life for these Paleo-Indian people was pretty basic. It wasn't easy. Every day was mostly about one thing: finding enough food. That's what everything else was about. They didn't have stores, no farms, no refrigerators, just whatever they could get from the land around them. Hunting was a big deal, but hard work. They went after those huge animals like mammoths and giant bison. Taking down something that big probably took a lot of people working together. It was dangerous. A mammoth could crush you easy. They used spears with those sharp stone points, like the Clovis ones. Sometimes they maybe used a special stick called an atlatl to throw the spear harder and farther. Like a stick that gives your arm extra power. Made hunting a bit easier maybe, but still tough. They also hunted smaller stuff when they could. Deer, rabbits, birds, whatever they could catch. Smaller game was safer and maybe more common later on. But hunting wasn't the only way to eat. They gathered stuff too. A lot of stuff. This was probably how they got food most days, honestly. Hunting big animals wasn't an everyday thing, so they looked for plants. Women and kids probably did a lot of this, digging up roots and tubers from the ground, picking berries when they were in season, collecting nuts like acorns or walnuts, finding seeds from wild grasses, maybe even grabbing insects or grubs sometimes. Whatever didn't poison you and filled your belly. They knew which plants were good and which were bad. That knowledge was super important. Passed down from older people to kids. They moved around a lot. They weren't like people today who live in one house for years. They were nomads. That just means they moved from place to place. Why? Because food ran out. Animals moved away. Seasons changed. Berries stopped growing in one spot. So they packed up their stuff and walked somewhere else. They followed the animals they hunted. They went where plants were growing good. Maybe they knew certain spots were better at certain times of year. They traveled light. You can't carry a ton of stuff when you walk everywhere. Their camps weren't fancy. When they stopped, they made simple shelters. Maybe just a lean-to. Some branches leaned against a rock or a log, covered with animal hides or big leaves. Sometimes they used natural places, like caves or big rock overhangs, to get out of the rain or wind or cold. They didn't build houses, just temporary places to sleep and stay dry for a little while. They had fires, for sure. Fire kept them warm, cooked their food, scared away animals at night, and gave them light. Making fire was a big skill. They made tools, but only from stuff they found, mostly stone. They were really good at hitting rocks together to make sharp edges. They made spear points, of course, but also other things. Scrapers for cleaning animal hides, turning a rough skin into softer leather for clothes or shelter covers. Knives for cutting meat or plants. Maybe little drills for making holes in wood or bone or leather. Sometimes they used bone or antler pieces for tools too. Wood was probably used a lot, for spear shafts, digging sticks, maybe bowls. But wood rots away fast, so we don't find much of it now. Just the stone parts last. What about clothes? Well, it was cold sometimes, especially early on. They probably wore clothes made from animal skins, hides cleaned and maybe softened, tied together with strips of leather or plant fibers. Simple stuff. Just enough to keep warm, maybe some fur for extra warmth. Footwear? Probably simple leather wraps or moccasins, something like that. Nothing fancy. Life was small group life. They probably lived in bands, small groups of families, maybe 20 or 30 people, sometimes more, sometimes less, traveling together, helping each other hunt, helping watch the kids, sharing food. It was safer together, easier to survive. They probably knew other groups, maybe met up with them sometimes at good spots, traded things, shared news, found partners for their kids. But mostly, it was their own little band, day in, day out. Kids learned by doing, watching the adults, helping with gathering, practicing making little tools, learning how to track animals, learning which plants were food. There wasn't school, just life. Getting older meant taking on more jobs, hunting for the men, gathering and making things for the women. Old people were important because they remembered things, where to find water in a dry time, how to treat a sickness, stories about the past. It was a simple life, but a hard one. Food wasn't always easy to find. Getting hurt or sick was bad news. No doctors. Bad weather could make things miserable. Animals could be dangerous. Babies and old people probably died more often than they do now. But they kept going. They did what they had to do to live in this big new land, day after day, year after year, slowly spreading out. Just living. Scientists can even see this connection now in a different way, through DNA. By studying the genes from very old bones they find, when they are incredibly lucky, and comparing them to the genes of modern Native American people, they see the direct link. The story is written right there in the genes. The first people who walked into America are the ancestors of the Native American people living here today. They are their great, add a whole lot more greats, grandparents. That family connection goes way, way back to those first small groups crossing the old land bridge and slowly spreading out across 2 huge continents. So the time we call Paleo-Indian ended, but the people didn't stop. They became the next people, who became the next people after that, all the way down to the present. They were the very beginning. So, these Paleo-Indian people lived a long, long time ago. Really long. Why do we even care about them now? What's the point? Well, it's simple. They were the first. The very first people to ever set foot in America and make it their home. Before them, no humans lived here. That's kind of a big deal, even if it was way back when. We know about them because of the stuff they left behind. Not much, but enough. Mostly stones. Those stone tools, especially the spear points, are like little messages from the past. When someone finds a Clovis point sticking out of the dirt, it tells us, hey, people were here, and it was a really long time ago. Finding different kinds of points later tells us things changed slowly over time. It's not exciting like finding gold, but it tells a story. The story of how people lived here first. The places where they lived, even just for a little while, are important spots now. Places where archaeologists dig carefully. Spots like that place in New Mexico with the old footprints, white sands. Or Cooper's Ferry in Idaho where they found really old tools. Or near Clovis, New Mexico, where they found lots of those special points. These places are like markers on a map showing where the first people walked and camped. Digging there tells us more about what they ate, what animals were around, and how they made their tools. It's slow work, looking at dirt and rocks, but it adds pieces to the puzzle. Another big reason they matter is who came after them. They didn't just vanish, they were the start. Over thousands and thousands of years, their way of life slowly changed. The big animals were gone. The weather was different. So their kids and their kids' kids had to live differently. They hunted different animals, gathered different plants, made slightly different tools, moved around in different patterns, slowly, very slowly, all across the huge land. New ways of living popped up. Different groups in different places started doing things their own way. But all these later people, the ones we call different Native American tribes, they all came from those first Paleo-Indians. It's like a family tree. The Paleo-Indians are the very first roots, the start of the whole thing. Scientists can even see this family connection in a different way now. They look at DNA, the stuff inside our bodies that makes us who we are. By carefully studying tiny pieces of very old bones, when they find any, and comparing it to the DNA of Native American people alive today, they see the link. It matches. The first people who walked into America are the ancestors of all the Native American people. It's a direct line. That connection in the blood goes back thousands of years to those small groups crossing the land bridge and spreading out. So knowing about the Paleo-Indians helps us understand where Native American people originally came from, long, long ago. Their story is also a story about change. The world changed around them. The ice melted, the big animals died, and they had to change how they lived to survive. They adapted. They figured out new ways to find food and make tools. They kept going. That's a pretty basic human story, really. Things change. People figure it out. It happened way back then, too. Finally, they matter because they were explorers. Not like explorers with ships and maps, but they walked into a totally new place. A huge, empty continent, for people anyway. They didn't know what was out there. They just kept going south, finding new rivers, new mountains, new valleys, filling up the land bit by bit, generation by generation. That took a long time and a lot of walking. They were the first to see these places, the first to live in them. That makes them the original pioneers of America, even if nobody wrote it down at the time. So yeah, they lived simply a long time ago, just looking for food, making tools, moving camp. Nothing fancy. But by being the first, by leaving a few stone clues, and by being the ancestors of everyone who came after, they earned their spot in the story. They are the beginning chapter of the long, long history of people living in the Americas. That's why we talk about the Paleo-Indians. They started it all. The time of the Paleo-Indians didn't last forever. Nothing does. Slowly, over many, many generations, things changed. Their way of life, focused on those big hunts and constant moving, faded away. But they didn't just disappear. They became something else. The story moved on. The biggest reason for the change was simple. The world got different. The weather warmed up a lot more. The giant ice sheets kept melting, shrinking back north. Forests grew thicker and spread out wider. Big open grasslands covered more land. The huge animals they used to hunt, like the mammoths and giant sloths, were gone for good. You couldn't find them anymore. So the old ways of hunting them didn't work. They had to find new ways to live. People adapted. They always do. Hunting didn't stop, but it changed. Instead of focusing on rare giant animals, they hunted smaller things much more. Deer became really important. So did rabbits, birds, turkeys, maybe fish and turtles. They got better at trapping smaller animals too. Gathering plants became even more crucial. People learned more about the nuts, seeds, roots, and berries all around them. They might have started to pay more attention to where certain plants grew well each year. Maybe they even helped some good plants grow a little, though they weren't farming like we think of it yet. Life was still about moving around, but maybe they stayed in one good spot a bit longer if there was plenty of food there. Their tools showed the change. Those special Clovis spear points, people made them less and less. They started making different kinds of stone points. Maybe smaller points better for deer or birds. Maybe points shaped differently for new ways of throwing the spear. Other tools changed too. Maybe they made more baskets for gathering nuts and berries. Maybe they made better grinding stones for crushing seeds. Things shifted slowly to fit the new foods they relied on. As the land changed, more places became easier to live in. The people spread out even further, filling in the spaces. But with more people in more places, and different plants and animals in different areas, groups started doing things their own way. What worked well near the coast might be different from what worked inland. What worked in the forests might be different from the grasslands. So slowly, the very old Paleo-Indian style, which was pretty similar across the board early on, started to break up. Different areas saw different kinds of tools and maybe different habits. The one big early way of life was turning into many smaller, more regional ways. The small family groups, the bands, were probably still the main way people lived. But maybe as they stayed in certain areas longer, they got to know the land better. They learned the best spots for certain plants each season, the best places to find deer, the good fishing holes. This deeper knowledge of a smaller area started to develop. They were putting down roots in a way, even if they still moved around within their familiar territory. So what do we call the people after the Paleo-Indian time? Scientists have different names for the next long period, like the Archaic period. But that's just a label. The important thing is that these were the same people, just their grandkids and great-grandkids living differently. They were the direct descendants. The Paleo-Indians didn't vanish. They slowly turned into the next generations who lived across America for thousands more years before Europeans showed up. The people who became the many, many different Native American tribes and nations all trace their family lines back to those first Paleo-Indians who walked into the empty continent. We know this connection is real. Scientists can look at DNA, the tiny instructions inside our cells that we get from our parents. By studying bits of bone from very old sites, when they're really lucky and find some, and comparing it to DNA from modern Native American people, they see the match. It lines up. The first people are the ancestors. It's a direct family line stretching back over thousands of years. The places where Paleo-Indians lived are still important. Archaeologists keep looking. They dig at sites like Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, or Deborah L. Friedkin in Texas, or the famous Clovis spots. They find those old stone tools, sometimes bones, sometimes ancient campfire ashes. Each find, even a small stone chip, adds a tiny piece to the story. It tells us where they went, roughly when they were there, and what they might have been doing. It's slow work, like putting together a giant puzzle with most of the pieces missing. But every bit helps. So, the Paleo-Indian time ended. It was the very first chapter. It closed because the world changed, the big animals vanished, and people had to change with it. But the people themselves kept going. They adapted. They learned new ways. They spread out. They became the foundation for everything that came after in the long history of people living in the Americas. Their story is the story of starting out in a huge, new, and often tough land. They were the first ones to figure it out. And then, slowly, they moved on to the next thing. The end of their beginning was just the start of everything else. We know about these really old people, the Paleo-Indians, because of things they left behind. Not a lot, but some stuff. Mostly it's stones. Stones they changed to make useful things. Finding this stuff is like finding little clues about their lives, long, long ago. The most famous things they left are their spear points, especially the kind called Clovis points. People find these points sticking out of dirt or buried in creek banks or when digging in certain places. Finding a Clovis point tells us one big thing. People were here a super long time ago. It's like a sign saying we lived here way back. Later on, people made different kinds of points. Finding those different points tells us time passed and things changed. They were probably hunting different animals or trying new ways. But they left more than just spear points. They made other stone tools too. Things like scrapers. These were probably for cleaning animal hides, making the skins softer for clothes or shelter. They made knives for cutting meat or plants. Sometimes little drills for making holes. They made tools out of bone or antler too, but those don't last as long as stone, so we find them less often. Finding these tools shows they knew how to work with what they had. Sometimes, very rarely, they find other things. Bones, but not just any bones. Animal bones that have cut marks on them. Marks made by stone knives or tools. This is proof they hunted and ate that animal. Finding bones of a mammoth with cut marks. That means they really did hunt those giants. Finding bones of deer or rabbits tells us they ate smaller stuff too. Even rarer than bones? Footprints. Yeah, actual footprints. Like at White Sands in New Mexico. Long ago, people walked on soft ground near a lake, their feet pressed into the mud. Then, over a super long time, that mud turned hard like stone. Now scientists find those footprints perfectly preserved. It's amazing, like seeing exactly where someone stepped thousands and thousands of years ago. You can see if they were walking or running, maybe even if kids were playing. They also find places where these people camped. Not houses, just spots they stayed for a little while. How do they know it was a camp? They find old fire pits, places where they made a fire to cook food or stay warm. The ash and burned wood and rocks are still there. Sometimes they find piles of stone chips. This is the leftover stuff from when they were making their stone tools. chipping away at rocks to make points or knives. Finding these chips means someone sat right there and made tools. Important places where they find a lot of this stuff have names now, like Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, or Deborah L. Friedkin in Texas, or of course near Clovis, New Mexico. These spots are like little windows into the past. Scientists dig there very carefully, layer by layer, like peeling back pages in a book. Each layer is from a different time. Finding stuff deep down means it's older. Finding stuff higher up means it's younger. This helps figure out roughly when people were there. Putting all this stuff together, the points, the tools, the bones, the footprints, the camp spots, tells a story. A simple story, but important. It tells us these people were here. It tells us roughly when they arrived and started spreading out. It tells us what they ate. Big animals at first, then more smaller stuff and plants. It tells us they moved around a lot, setting up camp, making tools, having a fire, then moving on. It tells us they were smart and knew how to make what they needed from stones and bones. Finding this stuff isn't easy. It takes a long time. Scientists dig slowly, carefully. They sift through dirt. They take notes on everything. It's not like the movies. It's slow, careful work. Most of the time, they don't find anything super exciting, maybe just a stone chip or a tiny piece of bone. But even small things add up. Each little find is another piece of the puzzle, a puzzle about the very first people in America. Why keep looking? Because every little bit helps us understand the beginning. How people first lived here, how they survived, how they changed over time. The stones, the bones, the footprints, they are the only voices left from that super long ago time. They tell the story when no one wrote anything down. They are the proof that the Paleo-Indians were here, starting it all. Digging in the dirt helps us hear that old story. Okay, so these Paleo-Indian people? They lived a crazy long time ago. We're talking way, way back, before pretty much anything else we know about in America. It feels like ancient history, stuff lost in the fog. But here's the thing. They didn't just poof disappear. Their story, in a real way, connects straight to people walking around today, especially to Native American folks. How does that work? It's actually pretty simple when you get down to it. The Paleo-Indians were their ancestors, like their super old-time grandparents. The absolute beginning of the family line over here. Think about your own family tree. Way down at the very bottom roots, that's where the Paleo-Indians sit for Native American people. Then, over thousands upon thousands of years, like more years than anyone can really picture, things happened slowly. Kids were born, grew up, had their own kids. Life shifted bit by tiny bit. Those giant animals everyone used to hunt, gone for good. The weather settled into something different, so naturally, how people lived had to change too. They started hunting different animals, smaller stuff like deer and rabbits. They gathered different kinds of plants and roots, learning what worked where. The tools they made shifted shape a little. Maybe groups started hanging around certain good spots for longer stretches, if the food was steady. And because America is huge, groups way up north started doing things differently than groups way down south, or groups near the ocean compared to groups deep inland. This all happened incredibly slowly, over more generations than anyone could count. This slow change, taking forever, eventually led to the many different Native American tribes and nations that were living all across North and South America for thousands of years, before any Europeans showed up in their big ships. All those different groups, each with their own languages, their own ways of doing things, their own stories and traditions. They all trace their family lines right back to those same first people who walked into this empty continent over the dry land bridge way back when. It's one enormous, unbroken family chain stretching back into the deep past. The Paleo-Indians are the very first link in that chain, the starting point. Scientists have a pretty neat way to actually see this connection now, which is kind of amazing. They look at DNA. DNA is this tiny stuff inside every single cell in your body. Think of it like a built-in instruction manual you get from your parents. Half comes from your mom, half from your dad, and they got their DNA from their parents, and so on, back and back through time. So DNA carries this hidden family history inside it. Sometimes, if they get really lucky, scientists can find tiny little pieces of DNA still hanging on in very old bones dug up from Paleo-Indian sites. It's tough work. Bones that old are rare, and the DNA inside is usually broken down and super hard to find. But sometimes, against the odds, they manage to get a little bit. When they do, they compare this ancient DNA to the DNA of modern Native American people. And guess what they find? It matches up. The patterns in the DNA from those old bones look like the patterns in the DNA of Native American people living today. It's like finding a direct family signature, proof written right into the body. It shows a clear, direct bloodline. The Paleo-Indians are the ancestors. They are the root of the family tree that grows straight up into the Native American people living now. That family story is carried right there in the blood, passed down silently from parent to child for more generations than anyone can number. This connection isn't just some dusty history fact. It's really important. It means the story of the Paleo-Indians isn't just about old stones and footprints. It's literally the first chapter of the whole story of Native American people in this land. Knowing where those first people originally came from, over from Asia, walking across that land bridge, and how they lived, how they survived, how they slowly spread out across the continents, helps explain the incredibly deep roots Native Americans have here. It shows their family didn't arrive recently from somewhere else. Their roots go down into this soil deeper than anyone else's, back to the very first people to ever call this place home. They've been here for thousands upon thousands of years, a connection to the land that stretches back to the beginning. Understanding this huge sweep of time also helps show just how much change happened over all those centuries. The Paleo-Indian way of life, chasing mammoths with spears, moving camp constantly, making those distinct Clovis points, that was just the opening act. The very first page. Over the immense stretch of time that followed, their descendants changed and adapted in incredible ways. They figured out how to live everywhere, in scorching deserts, in thick forests, on wide open plains, along rocky coasts. They developed hundreds of unique languages. They built rich cultures, complex traditions, and deep knowledge about the land. All of that amazing diversity, all those different ways of being, grew slowly and steadily from the seeds planted by those first small bands of people walking south into a vast, unknown, and empty new world. So when we talk about the Paleo-Indians, digging up their old spear points or finding their ancient footprints. We're not just talking about forgotten history. We're talking about the great-great-great, add 1,000 more greats, grandparents of the Native American people. That journey those first people made, walking into the unknown, their struggle to find food and survive in a brand new, often harsh land, their ability to change and adapt over time, that's the foundation. The absolute bedrock beginning of a story that is still unfolding right now, today. The Paleo-Indians were the very first people here. Everyone else who came later, much, much later, arrived on a continent already full of the descendants of those first brave explorers. That's the biggest connection, the most important thing to remember. They were the first ones here, starting it all, and their family is still here, carrying that long story forward. So, we've talked a bunch about these Paleo-Indian people. They lived an incredibly long time ago, way back before anything else we know here. They walked into America when it was totally empty of other people. They hunted huge animals that don't even exist anymore. They moved around constantly, never staying put too long. They made all their tools out of stone because that's what they had. Then, slowly, the world changed around them. The ice melted, the big animals vanished, and their way of life had to change too, bit by bit, over a very long time. But honestly, why should anyone today care about some old people from way back when? What's the point of digging up their old stones? Well, there are a few pretty solid reasons. First and biggest, they were the absolute first people here. That's a huge deal just by itself. Think about it. Before them, for tens of thousands of years, no humans lived anywhere in the whole enormous stretch of North or South America. None. Zero. Then, they came. They were the very first ones to see these mountains, these giant rivers, these wide open plains. The first to walk through forests that had never seen a person before. The first to figure out how to survive in this brand new place. Everything that came later, all the people, all the different tribes, all the history that happened over thousands of years, it all started with them. They were the pioneers who opened the door to this whole huge continent. They kicked off the entire story of people living in the Americas. That fact alone makes them super important. They began everything. Secondly, they didn't just disappear like smoke. They are the real deal ancestors. Their children grew up, had their own children, and those kids had more kids, and this kept going on and on for thousands and thousands of years. Slowly, incredibly slowly, over all that immense time, those descendants became the hundreds of different Native American tribes and nations that were thriving all across the land long, long before any Europeans sailed over. All those diverse groups, with their own rich languages, cultures, and traditions, trace their family lines directly back to those first small bands of Paleo-Indian explorers. It's a direct bloodline connection. Science can even show this now using DNA, that tiny code inside every cell that carries family history passed down from parents. Scientists have found that DNA from very old Paleo-Indian bones matches the DNA of Native American people living today. So, learning about the Paleo-Indians helps everyone understand the incredibly deep roots that Native American people have in this land. Their family has been here since the absolute first beginning. Their connection goes back further than anyone else's. Third, Their whole story is basically about people figuring stuff out against tough odds. They walked into a completely unknown world. Everything was new and strange. Weird, giant animals they'd never seen. Strange plants they had to test to see if they were safe. A climate that was shifting from super cold ice age conditions to something warmer. They had to adapt constantly. They had to learn what was good to eat, how to hunt different animals when the mammoths and sloths died out, where to find shelter from storms or cold. They had to make everything they needed, weapons, tools, clothes, from whatever they could find around them. Stone, bone, wood, animal skins. They had to keep moving to find food. Their story shows how humans can survive, adapt, and spread into brand new places, even really challenging ones. It's a fundamental human story of exploration and figuring out how to live. It just happened a really, really long time ago. Fourth, the little bit of stuff they left behind is like a quiet message from the deep past. It's not much, mostly just stone tools, sometimes animal bones. Very rarely something amazing like preserved footprints or the remains of an old campfire spot. But these ordinary things are actually powerful clues. Finding a Clovis point tells us clearly that people were definitely here a super long time ago. Finding cut marks on a mammoth bone proves they hunted and ate those giants. Finding footprints set in hardened mud shows us the exact spot where someone walked thousands upon thousands of years ago. These little bits of physical proof are literally all we have from that unimaginably distant time. They are the only way we know anything about the very first people to call this place home. Digging them up and carefully studying them, even though it means a lot of slow, careful work sifting through dirt and rocks, is how we piece together the very start of the human story here. Without finding those stones and bones, we simply wouldn't know this story existed at all. They are the only voices left from that time. Finally, they matter because they show just how incredibly long people have been connected to this land. Native American people aren't recent arrivals. Their roots here go straight back to these very first people who walked in. For the Paleo-Indians, this was the New World. They were the ones who explored it first, learned its secrets, figured out how to live in it, and their family has been an unbroken part of it ever since. Understanding the Paleo-Indian story helps everyone see that the history of people in America isn't short at all. It's mind-bogglingly long. It stretches back thousands upon thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down, before cities were built, before farms were planted. It all began with small groups of people walking slowly south across a huge land, carrying their few stone tools, always searching for the next meal, and becoming the very first to call this vast place home. That deep, long connection is fundamentally important. It's the true foundation. Knowing about the Paleo-Indians reminds us that the story of people here is much, much older than many folks realize. They were the absolute beginning, and the legacy of their journey and survival is still here, woven into the land and its first peoples.